Hi folks, it's Tabby and you're listening to the Modern Life Podcast. Find us on Instagram and Twitter at Modern Life Pod. I have Jason back with me today. He was on to discuss Dune on an earlier episode, and this time we're checking back in to see how the 2021 version compares to the book and the David Lynch film. We also have a second topic this time around, which is Pom Poko, a Japanese animated film from the 90s, which we're using as a framework to discuss larger issues around housing and the environment. There'll be timestamps in the description box if you're only here for one of the two films, and if you wanted to check out our previous episode on Dune, you can find it on modernlifepodcast.com.
My planet Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low. Rolling over the sands, you can see spice in the air. The outsiders ravage our lands in front of our eyes. Their cruelty to my people is all I've known. What's to become of our world?
Welcome back, everyone, to the Modern Life Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Dune and Pom Poko, so we're skipping the modern thoughts, and I have Jason back, and we're going to be talking about the new 2021 delayed Dune movie by Denis Villeneuve. Jason, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. We are finally getting into the fall weather here in Arizona, although it's still in like the 85s through the week, but otherwise can't complain.
Nice. So just a reminder for everyone, Dune is a sci-fi story of Paul Atreides and his rise to becoming the prophesized messiah of Dune. I don't think we need to go into a whole summary. We've done all that before. We're just going to give all our impressions about the new film. Jason, my first question is, did you watch this in the theater? Did you watch it at home?
I watched it at home. I really should have watched it in the theater, I feel like, because, giant sandworm looming over you. But no, I ended up watching it at home.
Me too.
What about you? Yeah.
I watched it at home, and I think that was the better choice, because one of my main issues with the film was the constant noise and the constant music, and there never being a moment of silence. And I started getting a headache, and I feel like that would have been even worse had I watched it in the theater.
I would have liked the theater experience, if only because there's such variation between the quiet speaking and the louder points of the film. And I feel like if it was in a theater setting, I wouldn't have to keep reaching for the remote to turn it up during the the speaking moments. But I totally understand what you mean, although I didn't think about it before you mentioned that about it. There's just no real moment of quiet. It's always moving. It's always doing something.
Yeah, and I don't have any issue with the music itself. I think it was just an issue for me of music supervision and how it was put in. And I think because the music was so constant too, for me the tone felt like the same all the way through. Even some of the big sad moments, like Duke Atreides dying, it left me really cold, because it was just the same kind of even pacing, the same music all the way through. I didn't feel like it ever hurried up, or even when there was an action scene, it kind of, I don't know how to describe it. In that scene with the factory where they're trying to get all the workers out of the factory before the worm arrives, you still have all these really slow scenes of Paul just staring at the sand. And I would have cut some of that out just to speed it up and make us feel a little bit more something's happening.
Hurried.
Yeah. So some of the editing for me was a little strange, or not in line with some of the moods they were trying to create.
I hear you on that. It's kind of like it's a ride or something like that. This is the Dune ride, and you go through the dips, you go through all of the normal motions of it. But yeah, I can understand what you mean about how it doesn't feel as lived in some ways. I will say though, overall, if I had to, pick this one or the David Lynch film, this is the one that I would have been super excited to see as my first Dune movie over the Lynch one, even though I really appreciate the David Lynch interpretation and efforts on this. But yeah, I think there's plenty to pick apart with this film as well. It's not imperfect, and it's not imperfect in the funny and like brazen. I can't really think of the words to describe like just the incredible ways that David Lynch chose to interpret some of this stuff. It was just so far out and like
Yeah.
such a bigger reach than I think this film does.
I think something that both films didn't quite do for me was, and maybe this is just me, maybe this is just how I'm imagining it, but the world of Caladan, that's supposed to be like this greenish world, was again gray. Because again, this movie has like not just the same tone, but I feel like the same tones of colors all the way through. Even if you're in the desert, even if you're in Caladan, there's this like gray sheen over everything. They very deliberately only had everyone wear black or gray for the whole film, which I thought was a choice. I don't know, but
Yeah.
you know, it felt more like a dark Ireland than like this lush world. I feel like he did that on purpose just to show the contrast between Paul being completely out of his depths. But I never quite got that feeling based on how they portrayed the planet.
Yeah, Caladan, I think they really were going for like Scotland, the planet, is kind of what it seemed like.
Yeah, something like that.
And especially because they, you know, chose at several points for the battle music, the bagpipes, as kind of the summoning. And I was like, yeah, I mean, they're really trying to, this is a marsh people, for the most part. But you're right. It is like very muted and very staid in a lot of ways, even over on Caladan. They went for the Scotland version of water as opposed to like the Caribbean or the Caribbean.
Maybe
like,
I'm just the only person who was imagining that when they were reading the book. I don't know.
I don't think I would have picked Scotland for that, you know, as like the comparison, but I probably would have picked something closer to that than like tropical. I don't know why, you know, like, no, I believed it. House Atreides is just such a dour, I mean, you know, they're such a dour family in all of this too, where it's kind of like, yeah, of course they come from a dreary, you know, like mist blown place. There's a ton of water, but I wish I could remember anything more than like 2 years ago. I was trying to make a Game of Thrones equation. They're the house from the north, basically, is how I would describe
I can see
the
that.
Atreides.
Yeah. The first part of the film also had some of my favorite scenes, honestly. I love the way they introduced the voice by having them eat breakfast and Lady Jessica asking him to pass the water, you know, make me pass the water. I was like, oh, this is a really quick, nice exposition. You know, we get what she's trying to do. And then also the conversation between Paul and his father, I thought was very touching, where he tells him like, oh, you're the only thing I ever needed you to be was my son. And that also set up the relationship very nicely. And then also contrasted it between the nephew and uncle of the Harkonnen house and kind of their relationship, which is kind of the opposite of this nice family. But and also the bullfighting, I'd forgotten about that. I don't know if that was in the original Dune book or if that was in some of the later ones, but I couldn't remember that they have this family history of the grandfather like bullfighting.
I think it is in the book. I don't remember it at all in the David Lynch film. But yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting point to blow up for this film and like make it a much more prominent aspect of their history. I even thought the little statue that was kind of angular in, I don't know, like 80s or 90s kind of way was like a really cool construction as well. Like as a prop, I thought it was really neat.
I agree.
Yeah, no. I will say on that one opening where they are demonstrating the use of the voice, I mean, it's one of the first things that you come across in the film. There's kind of a weird Oedipal or like sexual tension between Paul and his mother. And in the opening scene, you know, like maybe the third thing that she says to him is, if you want it, make me give it to you, which I think that was an intentional sort of just like, there is this weird tension between these two that I think is like tapping into some older tradition of like talking about the relationship between like son and mother or something. I don't know. I didn't pick up on it a ton in the rest of the film, although there is a point when they are both having to undress and get on like their still suits or whatever. and they both kind of like glance at each other. I don't know. This film is kind of tapping into a weirdness of their relationship that I picked up on in the book, and David Lynch like totally glossed over.
I didn't pick up on that at all. I didn't see it like that, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the only person seeing that, but just as like the third thing, you know, in the movie, she's like telling him to exert force over her. You know, sets up this kind of weird, I don't know. It's maybe I'm reading something into this, but I'm also someone who I have a history of not reading enough into the sexual nature behind things. Like in Lord of the Flies, I never picked up on the scene where they're like stabbing the pig, that they're implying that the kids had sex with like the pig. Totally missed that.
Okay.
I read that book multiple times, and
why multiple times?
I think I was assigned to read it, and then it was like on a list of books that I could write about for like AP or something later. So I was like, sure, I'll pick a book I've already read. That's easy. That's more time I can spend playing video games instead of reading a book.
Makes sense.
But yeah, so I'm not very sensitive to this sort of stuff, but for whatever reason, I was picking up on it in the book, and I'm glad they did something with it maybe in the film, but you didn't pick it up, so maybe I'm still just reacting. Who knows?
I want to go back to the environments of the film one more time, because something that, again, I don't think was well done, or maybe like a little bit of a misfire, was just the world of Dune and how oppressive it is. And we had this conversation with the first movie, and here we are again. Like, the actors just don't seem to experience heat, and to kind of show you how much sand there is, there are just these shots after shots of just showing the environment with like the music swelling, the music never stops, and it's like, here's another shot of a dune. But to me at home, that doesn't do anything to convey to me like what this world is like. Like, for example, the scene of Paul in the gardener, he's still wearing his like black polyester suit. He's not wearing sunglasses or a hat, or he's chill. Like, this doesn't affect him at all. And yet the gardener, who's been living on this planet the whole time, is like decked out completely, protecting himself. But like Timothée Chalamet has to be like the pretty boy of the movie, so he's barely even sweating. And I think something that does this really, really well is The Hateful Eight by Tarantino, where you feel how cold it is for the whole film, because the actors are showing you how cold it is, and they're in the house most of the time. You don't see the snow really that much, yet you still get that feeling from the film. And I wish that they had used that as their example for Dune and just done a little bit more with the environment.
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought up The Hateful Eight, which I finally watched this last year. And that you're right. It's like a bottle episode in a movie, basically, where they just are in the one setting, and you know it's cold outside. I mean, from the way everyone's reacting to the way they're dressed or whatever. As someone who is like worked out in the heat, wearing like neoprene like waders, it's hot. You know, even when you're like lightly dressed under that. But yeah, he's in like all black. He's speaking with a local who's like, you shouldn't be out here in this. And like, that's as much of a taste of the heat as you even get in, you know, the film, basically. Otherwise, you know, they kind of describe it through the absence of plant life and like animals or whatever, except for the mouse. And I mean, you know, living out in the desert where it gets, you know, up to like 120, like I'm sweating within 2 seconds of like being outside, and you're nervous and looking around. There's an existential dread that you really develop, or that I certainly developed, but I'm also pale as all hell, that you develop like in the desert. And it's really funny, like just walking around here, how much everyone like weaves when they're walking just to get under like a bit of shadow. And it just becomes this sort of like background instinct to it. But you're right, they don't get into the psychology of what it's like to live in a very hot, very dry place all the time. He never has to moisturize either, you know? Like, I have to moisturize all the damn time out here. I take all this stuff for granted.
Just don't get it, because that's what the whole book, that's the title of the book, like, and the book does it so well, of like showing this extreme weather and the cultures and how they function. And yet again, it's like, oh, we have to show the actors' faces, so we can't have them wear their still suits properly, or like wear their hats, or wear their. It's just maybe this book just doesn't work as a movie. I don't know what it is.
People want to show a lot of face in these, and of course it's the desert, and you really need to be heavily shaded, so you can't just film everyone with like slanted shadows like over their eyes the entire time. Not everyone can be a mysterious samurai.
The thing that was really good, though the bar was very low, was the shields. I really liked the CGI around the shields, how that was done. But I mean, before we had like weird geometric shapes, so.
Right, yeah. I mean, the shields in the David Lynch film were pretty hilariously done, and you're right, the bar is incredibly low. Like, can you depict a more realistic shields using computer graphics in 2021 than you could in whenever Dune was made, 84, I forget. Yeah, no, the shields I thought were really well done. At least in the close-up fight between, oh my god, it's not Thufir Hawat, it is Gurney Halleck. There we go. When Paul is training with Gurney Halleck in the early scene, and they do the slow blade there, and I thought that was a good demonstration. But like later on in like the big battle scenes, I couldn't tell that anyone was doing like a sort of slow, blade to get underneath the shield. In those later portions, and I'm like, this just looks like a regular sword fight, but I think otherwise they did a good job. Did they explicitly say in the film that this is the reason why we don't have projectile weapons and that we all have to fight by sword, or were people
No, that was not. I don't know that they even put that in the film, because
that's what I mean.
The Duke Atreides is wearing a shield and he's getting hit with a dagger or something.
Yeah, the projectile. God, I forgot the name. The venomous bug robot, the Seeker, right? Or
I don't know, but maybe they just chose not to go that route for the film, or thought it was too much explanation. I don't know.
But I think this is the explanation in the book for why like the shields are critical. It's like this is how we get back to not everyone using projectile weapons and so forth, and battles become this much more close-up and sort of intimate sort of experience. But I feel like they totally glossed over that in film. They're just like, yeah, we have shields, we fight with swords. But like, to someone who has not read the book or who has not damaged their brain by thinking about Dune as much as I have, I don't know that would be an obvious sort of like, oh, okay, that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think you had more things to say though on the action scenes as well, right? Like the use of wires and some of the stunts.
There were some interesting choices on all of it. The use of wires was just kind of excessive.
Strangely, obvious. Where I'm like, did you mean maybe they meant to make it obvious? I don't know. It didn't feel like it was supposed to be natural.
That's what I was like trying to figure out with it too, because I was like, if this is supposed to be demonstrating like the power of the spice, then maybe I could get behind it. But these are people who are pre-spice, who are doing these like sort of superhuman feats already. No one's really on the spice diet in this part of the film, but I feel like that's going to take away from it and like the future fight scenes, because you're like, what are you comparing this to? Well,
right, yeah.
I don't know. There's just some like cheesy fight choreography. I think US fight choreography is just bad in general. It's like too short of cuts, and there's always this like absurd level of like acrobatic effort in a lot of it. Like in the same fight scene, I think it's when Paul is envisioning, future battles, where he rolls over the back of like two people to execute these, like sick moves or whatever. Then I guess he's on spice during that one, but it's just stupid. Like as a fighting technique, it like relies on them to be stationary and to support your entire weight, as you're like rolling over them. And sure, it kind of like looks cool in some ways, but there's like so many other interesting things that could happen. And instead it sort of just ends up being this really distracting, like, you could have like jumped over him or walked around him. Like there's any number of other things. Like, I don't know, this is like parkour over humans and just like totally excessive in a battle where you're concerned about people coming at you from like multiple angles. My gold standard for fights is Jackie Chan films and like Ong Bak or something, which were really incredible because the people actually fighting were just incredibly talented and spent a lot of time on the choreography. And this stuff just seems like cheap. Like, all right, yeah, I mean, they're fighting. This one does like a flying double kick into the chest of somebody else, and I guess that's like cool. But even like wrestlers can do that and not need like wire fighting. Like it's totally unnecessary. Anyway, I've got opinions.
No, I hear you. Yeah, it's also like tough to protect actors and they're only doing action scenes, and then the stunt scenes are separate, and like you said, it's very different from maybe also in a better way than like Jackie Chan like destroying his body for every movie.
Yeah, it's maybe, I mean, destroying his body and the body of everyone else on set. I just watched Police Story last year as well, and if you haven't seen it, that is one of the most incredible stunt films that I've ever seen. And I don't know, maybe I'm still just riding on that high. I'm just like, everything sucks in comparison to this.
There were some exposition things that I thought were also quite strange. In that scene that you mentioned, where Gurney Halleck and Paul are training, he says, oh, I don't want to, I don't feel like doing this right now, and can't you just play us a song instead? This never comes back. This is never explained. This just feels like one of these, like, weird gatekeeping, like, oh, you only get this if you've read the book. And I'm like, but why put it in here at all? Like, it...
Right.
If I'm watching this, I'm like, what song? Like, what is he talking about? And also, like, all the weird terms they've included, like the Bene Gesserit are called by their actual name. They're also called the Weirding Women. They're called witches. So you have like 3 terms for this one person.
Yeah.
They use the Quiznab, whatever it's called, Haderach. Yeah, they use that like in the voiceover of the desert, like whispering it. But then for some reason, the word planetologist was like too far. They're like, we have to cut this. Like, nobody knows what a planetologist is. And they like changed her name. And I'm like, just the choices you made on like what to include and what not, it's just bizarre to me. Like, same with Jessica and Duke Leto, where I feel like their relationship is very unexplored, and if I hadn't read the book, I wouldn't understand why aren't they married, like what's going on with them. Like, they seem to really like one another, but like, again, there's very little time spent on that, and that's, I think, one of the most interesting and loving relationships in the book.
I think they do a good job in the film of outlining the underlying tension from all of it. I mean, it's unclear, well, why doesn't he marry his concubine? I don't even remember it being that clear in the book either. Like, what's he holding out for?
He was trying to make himself more valuable in the eyes of like the emperor, because if he stayed single, he could still be like coupled with some of the greater houses, and like some of the like political stuff that's going on in the book. But that again, that could have been like one line of dialogue. That could have been one line of, why aren't you married? I don't know. So there's these really easy fixes that I feel like, what? Okay, but then why did we not put that in, but we put in the 20 shots of the desert? Which is weird.
But yeah, in terms of their relationship, I thought, I don't know. I think his argument with, so Duke Leto's argument with Jessica over Paul suddenly, kind of having like a dark shadow cast over him after he goes through the trial, I thought was kind of interesting. And a good way of describing the inherent tension at the core of their relationship, where like, yes, there is real love and real feeling between these two, but ultimately, a good portion of why Jessica is there is to complete this 10,000 year eugenics project. And of course, that's going to create a bit of tension between you. And I think at one point where he is like, or where Duke Leto is asking Jessica if she'll watch over Paul. He's like, of course, I love my son. Or he's like, no, I'm asking as a Bene Gesserit, will you watch over him? Because he has to think about both of those aspects, where regardless of whatever her personal feelings are, she seems to have to obey the sort of higher calling as a Bene Gesserit, although she does betray it, by having a male son, which is explicitly against the wishes of the Bene Gesserit at large. I don't know. I think they definitely could have gone deeper into their relationship. Like, it's not clear why they like each other at all, except like, we got a kid together and presumably we've been living together for a while. But there's really no, what is it about each other, that they really like? And there's nothing on that.
Yeah, I just wish, because I loved those scenes actually, and I just wish there was a little bit more of that.
Yeah. Duke Leto, notorious funny guy who can always make Jessica laugh, like just any sort of like, what is the structure underneath this?
Yeah, this movie did not have any humor in it, did it? I can't remember. Maybe Jason Momoa cracks like one joke. I don't know.
Yeah, Duncan, Idaho, I think is the only glimpse of like comedic relief in it. I think there's like some comic tension with the spitting, but yeah, otherwise it's a pretty humorless and sort of like dark film. But I kind of feel like that's pretty accurate to the book.
Yeah,
honestly.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot. And I'm glad they didn't try to like Marvel or Joss Whedon it up about like, are we really doing this right now? I think we're doing this right now. Like, we're riding the worm. Yeah.
Why are there now 2 Dune movies with black sludge? I literally went back to the book and I was like, is this in the book? In the Lynch one, he's like flying through that oil spill, and then in this one, he's like coming out of the healing chamber, which is like black sludge. And I'm like, was this in the? At this point, I'm just believing it was in the book because they keep putting it in these movies.
I don't think it was in the book.
I don't think so either, but like it seems to be a thing to do.
Yeah, no, I thought that was like one of the coolest things that Lynch did, was with Baron Harkonnen, whose name is Vladimir, which I didn't remember from the book at all. I'll maybe talk about this in a bit, but they mention it, at least in the subtitles, when I was watching this the second time through to actually get all the dialogue that I missed because they whispered it.
Lots of whispering again with this.
Yeah, and not in the commanding way. But yeah, when Baron Harkonnen is like flying underneath that like shower of black sludge, gleefully and just kind of like cackling or whatever, like I thought that was a really funny and awesome way of like, man, this guy loves being evil, like, he loves it. You're right. I didn't really think about the connection between that and the black sludge that he's like healing up in and like emerges out of. In this one either, but I liked it.
maybe it was an homage to David Lynch. I don't know.
Yeah, not all of this was bad. They kept him flying, which I guess in the book he also does have some sort of like anti-gravity belt or something like that. But I think they did the flying aspect really cool in this film. I gotta say, I was complaining about the wire stuff earlier, but it makes sense in the Baron Harkonnen aspect of this.
Just in general, I thought this was a pretty good script, and I wish that most of the actors hadn't been mumbling their lines so much. I'm like, why is this a thing now? Please speak up. But yeah, there's lots of things to love about this film. Lots it gets right. I loved when they're trying to get away right before Jason Momoa's character dies, and the planetologist is like, quick, we can go this way, that she like is guiding them through that, and not the scene from the book where Paul's like, I know there's a secret entrance over there because I know everything. I'm like, why is Paul so boring? Like, I think they tried to make him a little bit more interesting in this one.
Sorry, random fact, I had to look this up. Kyle MacLachlan is the guy who played Paul Atreides in the David Lynch film. Timothée Chalamet is, of course, the one who plays him in this film. They are the same age at the age when they played Paul Atreides, which is so funny to me because, like, Paul MacLachlan just looks like he has been 35 probably since he was like 15 or something. So, it was always really funny because in the book, Paul is 15 years old. And so I never bought the father-son relationship between Kyle MacLachlan and the original Dune film. But I mean, Timothée Chalamet just looks boyish because of his like build. He has like a thin jaw as opposed to like Kyle MacLachlan's more, I don't know, classical, wider jawed and normal, more typical build. I don't know, but I thought that was so funny to me. And it was like so much more believable as a younger character who's like naive and doesn't really understand his like position in the world, as opposed to McLaughlin, who's, you know, again looks like 35 and looks like he's already like a manager somewhere in this. But Timothy is much more child-esque.
I feel like he's probably going to be one of those actors who's just going to stay, you know, like Thomas Brody Sangster, like they're just going to stay looking a child forever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they do a really good job of like his excitement to see Duncan, Idaho, you know, and like them being like much more buddy. It feels more like an uncle nephew kind of relationship, and it seems, you know, genuinely sweet. Like he's excited in the way that like a kid would be, like, yeah, my sick uncle is here, hell yeah. And I thought the Paul character was much better done in this. He actually seems like much more torn about his position and potentially resentful about it as well, which the David Lynch version of this was just Paul succeeding more and more until he succeeds all over the planet. And this one, he's much more tormented by it and tormented by the visions and doesn't necessarily like what is happening to him. But he's figured out how to navigate it.
Agreed.
Yeah. Probably the biggest note that I have is, you never read Dune Messiah, right?
No.
Which is
I just read the Wikipedia entry.
Yeah, I never did either. But it turns out I was listening to a podcast. The podcast is called American Prestige with Danny Bessner and Derek Davidson, I think are the two people who run it. And they interviewed this professor who I think is over at like Northwestern, who wrote really extensively about Dune and the author of Dune and his life, and got into a lot of stuff that I had thought I had some handle on, but it turns out really didn't. The first key thing is that apparently Dune and Dune Messiah are really meant to be read together, and not, you know, Dune is the good one and Dune Messiah is the one that like nobody reads or should care about. Regardless of whatever the quality is, it was always the author's intent to basically set up an ambush for the reader, because Paul becomes a very reprehensible, like, genocidal leader, and not in a good way of like, you know, just going and exterminating like the Harkonnen or whatever. Like he really goes off the rails, and you are really supposed to feel conflicted about this character who you kind of cheered on as throwing off the Harkonnen offensive in it. And this movie, in ways that I don't remember David Lynch tapping into at all, really gets into that future darkness. And I really hope they make a sequel to this, and potentially like a third one. I don't know how it would necessarily line up, because if I envisioned a second film, it would just be the rest of the first Dune book. But if there was like a third one that actually goes into the Dune Messiah aspect of it, they would really have to go into, you know, like all of the things that you have a problem with as a reader that you kind of like brush aside because you're like, oh, maybe it was just like the times or whatever. Like the Bene Gesserit like 10,000 year campaign to set up this religious fervor about the Kwisatz Haderach and all of that is inherently messed up, you know, like it's not good. Without that sort of like second novel establishing the fact that like everyone viewed him as a messiah and kind of followed him in ways that were more unquestioning than they probably would if he was just like a regular political figure. And when he goes full genocide, under any other circumstance, you would recognize that this is like really fraught, and not even fraught. Don't do genocide. So like this is really set up in this film because Paul has visions of, I forget the exact quote, but it's like an army or like a pile of skulls underneath the House Atreides banner, this war fought in the name of like my father and so forth. And like he's tortured by it, by all of like the horrible violence he's seeing. And I think just reading the first book, if you only think about it in those terms, you're like, yeah, I mean, the war is bad, but ultimately it's to get the Harkonnen out of there and to reclaim Dune. And that's not necessarily such a bad thing, but it's not about that. It's about what happens in Dune Messiah, where it goes fully off the rails, and you're kind of getting admonished for like, yeah, you shouldn't unquestioningly just accept all of this because there was some like small amount of liberation in this planet, which I think, you know, really makes me want to read Dune Messiah. I think that's a really cool sort of lesson from this book that I never got, watching the David Lynch film or watching or rereading like the first book a couple of times. I hope they do a sequel, at least the one to like round out the first Dune novel. But honestly, I hope they do a third one to tap into that darkness, which I think the script really sets up in some small ways. But like
there was that scene of them coming back, Chani and him and everyone coming back to Caladan. There was like a vision of that, so they might go into that. I mean, we did talk a little bit when we did our first episode on Dune how this is like, it's very on the nose. Paul is Jesus. What do you do when you don't question your religious leaders, and like how far does that go? And I think and hope that the movie does that in a more subtle way and has a little bit more finesse about it, because I think that a lot of the themes that Frank Herbert tries to look at and examine are, he does it sometimes very heavy-handedly, if that makes sense. Like he can be a little on the nose with some of the things he's trying to communicate to the readers. Yeah.
So one other thing about Frank Herbert that I learned when I was like reading this book, I mean, which came out in the 1950s, 1960s, I think. So Frank Herbert was actually conservative, but he came from a leftist, like he grew up on a commune in Oregon originally, but he became very conservative because he grew increasingly cynical of like the federal government and their interference in particular with indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. This is very different than I think like how most people's political ideology has evolved like toward the left in this country, where like the federal government does a better job at a lot of things than like the states do, which have just kind of let everything fall apart. But the longer history, of course, in the federal government and dealing with indigenous peoples is stealing lands, not recognizing claims, etc. And so a lot of Frank Herbert's ideas about indigenous people, which comes through in Dune, has to do with like the federal government's like complete inability to deal with indigenous people even-handedly, and has like a deep distrust of the federal government and of these places that came out of that. But it basically is like development theory, which is a little bit different than just like the previous sort of like racism about like indigenous people. Like they're not capable at all of doing any of this stuff. So, subjugate them, clear them off the land or whatever. There was this idea about like, well, if you bring them the technology, bring them the education, then we can modernize them. When they become modernized, they will naturally be the allies of us. Which is what Canada did. It's what the United States did in, the United States, but also in other countries around the world. A lot of his thinking originally, it was kind of along those lines. It was this sort of modernization theory. And so you see this kind of struggle between these two ideas in the book, between the Harkonnen, who just kind of subjugate and are just like, these people are completely worthless, they need to be wiped out, versus the House Atreides, which comes in and are much more the modernizing force that's trying to like give them the technology and give them the help or whatever, so that they become the natural allies of this. And so in Messiah, he is much more critical of that because he has a longer view of the situation. Number one, this kind of like, you need to be careful about who you're making allies with in these different regions, because often you just kind of go for the more powerful, and people often gain power through underhanded means or whatever. So you can prop up these sort of like regimes that end up being not necessarily healthy or whatever. There's these levels of interference that kind of come into play. Anyway, like, so you're right. Frank Herbert doesn't deal with a lot of this stuff like very, I don't know. He's very coarse with a lot of his writing. But like, I really had no idea about the political ideology that he was like growing up with, and what he was talking about in terms of the competing political ideologies that, then became major issues in South Vietnam and in the decade of his book being released. Like, it was actually surprisingly prescient about like U.S. Foreign relations after like the book was released. Anyway, really cool stuff. I should send you that podcast episode. But
we'll definitely put it in the description. Yeah, this is really good background knowledge to know. And you just reminded me of something I was going to ask you. When Duke Leto is the first person to protect the workers at the mine instead of the spice, the planetologist kind of shoots him this look, and it's never explained. Like, there's never a line of like, oh, I decided to defend your family because they were the first ones to actually care about the people here. Like, there was never a line like that in the movies. And I was wondering, I can't judge now because I've read the book and I know this, like, but do you think that somebody who hasn't read the book would make that connection?
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think it would.
Yeah.
It's tough to imagine just watching this film and like having that be your only
Right.
like exposure to it. I really wonder. I don't know how young people communicate about this stuff, but I mean, it's like a book from half a century ago, like
Yeah.
it's tough to imagine that a lot of the youth have like really read this. There was kind of this resurgence when I was growing up, and maybe there's going to be that again, but as a result of the movie, and certainly there's not a wave leading up to this movie of like young people reading Dune.
Right.
So I don't know. I cannot imagine that they're going to pick up from that.
No, I don't think so either. And again, that would have such an easy fix. Why are you helping us? Oh, your dad was the first one to easy. Like,
Yeah.
it's one line. Like, it's just so strange. Some of the like choices they make in terms of like making this accessible to a new audience. And when my brother was in the theater the other day, he was watching something else. There was a trailer for Dune, and the kids next to him are like, what is this, a Star Wars ripoff? So, which is hilarious to me, because Star Wars is based on Dune. But, so yeah, kids aren't gonna know, like, what Dune is, or like, what the book is. And so I just wish they had done a little bit more to make things more clear.
Actually, kind of speaking about this, and this is a little bit related, because we talked about in the first episode we did, how the messages of like Dune are not necessarily good, like there's a lot of problematic framing, like even Paul as a character. And I noted this when I was watching it, that when Paul puts his hand in the cube and like passes that test or whatever in the book, and maybe even in the David Lynch film, I can't remember, Jessica's talking with the head, Bene Gesserit, and they explicitly talk about how like he did better than any woman or any girl child.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Like that. And, they conveniently did not bring that up in this sort of film. He is definitely, a sort of prophet, but the ladies are doing just fine too. They don't bring that up. Like the casting decisions I thought were really interesting. It's like trying to bring in sort of a multiracial, multi-ethnicity sort of like casting element to it. But like, the core material is the core material. I'm really curious how they're going to go through the second, like if they do a sequel to this, what that's going to look like, because, they can get around the fact that like, yes, Paul is better than all the women in this film, but like so much of Empire is going to happen in the next film, and Empire is not good, which is why I think you have to do the third film to actually get the points across that the youth would actually agree with. It's not like, well, you just need to do Empire in the right way. It's like, no, Empire's bad.
Yeah. I think they leaned into those themes of colonialism in a better way, like just the way the movie starts out and Chani kind of narrating, these people coming into our planet and we're trying to take them out. I was like, oh, that's already like something we can relate to with our modern lens a little bit better. Also, the fact that they just took out all the homophobia.
There was a lot of tension for me around like the Baron Harkonnen portrayal, because like in the book, they're like, he is a disgusting fat.
Oh yeah,
piece of
fat
shit,
people are gross, and yeah, it's rough.
He's definitely portrayed as a heavier individual. I don't know how to properly say that in the film, but they don't, and he's like eating Duke Leto's dinner, like at his table. They don't make it as like a central, he's disgusting because he's fat,
Right.
sort of thing. That was definitely part of the book. It's just interesting how they're like trying to not step on the third rail on a lot of these issues, but they're like, it's a critical part of his character, yeah.
Anything else about Dune?
No, I will note that one of the plants that they mentioned that you can plant on Planet Dune is the saguaro, which is the characteristic cactus of the northern Sonoran Desert. But they show no saguaro, which is a disappointment. That would have been cool. Saguaro cacti are the classic cacti, with like the two arms sticking out of it.
Like in the Westerns?
Like in the Westerns. It is the iconic cactus. It's actually extremely unique to like this part of the desert. Only other cool thing, Thufir Hawat's umbrella that he's walking around with is, I guess, I have that in my notes. He's got the really dainty umbrella, which I thought was awesome. And also, one of the only other things about like how intense the sun is, but you know, even then, he's not like sweating up a storm. Just like, I'm keeping the sun off me.
Yeah, that umbrella was cute though.
Yeah, the umbrella is very cute. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I would say otherwise. I mean, how'd you like it? Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down, middle.
Just the thing I walked away with from this film was just having a headache, and it started to devolve into us like making fun of the music and copying the singing, and like once we started talking as a family and not watching the movie anymore, like. The movie has lost us, so I can imagine maybe watching it again, like with just subtitles and turning the sound off. But yeah, I'm sorry, Denis Villeneuve. Good effort though. I feel really bad because this is such an expensive movie, and
you know, I follow a lot of people on Twitter who really liked it, honestly. I mean, like older people who are old school Dune heads, who are like, no, I mean, it was a legitimately good film. And I will say that if I was waiting, you know, for a long time, I think the David Lynch film is still like good and interesting. But just as like a fanboy, this would be the one that I would want to see. Where I'm like, oh my god, they did the shields really well.
Mm-hmm. Like, yeah. Alrighty, so we're jumping into our next topic, which is Pom Poko. This is a 1994 film directed by Isao Takahata, animated by Studio Ghibli, and Hayao Miyazaki was one of the writers. Most of the movie takes place in the 90s and concerns new housing developments that have replaced farmsteads to accommodate for an increase in population around Tokyo. This affects the local wildlife like raccoons and foxes. The story follows the fun-loving raccoons in their attempt to perfect their magical shape-shifting powers to fight back against the construction. Before we dive in, I just want to say this is a bit of a niche movie. We don't expect all our listeners to have seen it, so we'll describe it more carefully to you, but if you're so inclined, it is also currently available on HBO. But I think the movie's a great springboard for discussions on broader environmental issues, which is why I'm thinking you chose this one. This was such a random choice. Like, as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, this is such a Jason choice. Tell me why you picked it.
Well, I picked it because it has long stood in my head as the key. I mean, you didn't mention this in your summary, but this is key lore to the film. It is a Hayao Miyazaki film, or with Studio Ghibli, that involves the use of raccoon scrotums as a key action points and key rallying points. Like, somebody shared a screenshot from Pom Poko years ago online, you know, that I happened to see in some forum or something, where it's just a bunch of tanuki, the raccoon dogs, native to Japan, with just these, you know, little scrotums just hanging out like underneath them. They're like wearing clothes up top, but on bottom they're, you know, nude,
naked.
So they're like they're Porky Pigging it, but unlike Porky Pig, they draw the ball sack in every single scene. And I was just like, what is this? Like, is this a children's film?
It is a children's film
that Hayao Miyazaki worked on. I mean, and like it's more than that too. Like, they're flying around on their scrotums. Like, they're doing all kinds of raccoon dog mischief.
So you picked this movie because you wanted to talk about raccoon scrotums. Got it.
Well, I mean, that's the original reason I watched it, because I was just like, what the hell is this film? And then it ended up turning out to be like a sort of parable about environmentalism and so forth. And I was like, oh, this is very different than I just thought of, like mischievous raccoons. And so, long story short, I have a very morbid curiosity about these images from like a decade and a half ago, probably. And then I happened to be like scrolling through Miyazaki films on HBO, because I haven't seen a lot of them, and saw that one was actually included on there, and, you know, immediately added that to my watch list. So I was like, you know, I'll watch the other ones first, but I gotta get around to this eventually. Yeah,
the shape-shifting using like the testicles, it remains unchanged in all the DVD releases, but then in English, they changed the subtitles. They keep calling it raccoon pouches, which is just like,
Yeah.
I can just see the translator working on this being like, what the fuck? Like, so props to them for coming up with the term raccoon pouch.
Yeah. Two key translation differences when you get the subtitled version is, of course, in the Japanese one where you're watching the subtitles, so and not the dubs. They always refer to the raccoons as tanuki, which is actually a different species than raccoons. They are colloquially referred to as raccoon dogs, as kind of the general description of them, but they're actually distinct from raccoons, and they're really cool looking. They kind of just look like a raccoon and a wolverine got crossed or something. They look a little more aggressive than your standard raccoon. Not that there's anything wrong with raccoons. But then, yes, the other thing where they refer to the scrotum as the raccoon pouch instead of the scrotum, which they definitely, like, all the subtitles in the Japanese version is just like scrotum. But yes, very fun. I mean, like, how do you wrangle that? Like, you talked about, it's really funny, that sort of invention of that term for this, because yeah, I mean, like, this movie was huge in Japan. It brought in a ton of money. I think the amount was somewhere around like 50 or 60 million is what it netted, like, at the time. Then you have to, like, bring it to the American shores, and it's like, yeah, it's like a fun animated film for children, but there are prominent scrotums. That is absolutely a critical part about this, and we're going to have to figure out a way. But, you know, like, we're leaving money on the table if we don't do this. So
The other thing that really shocked me too is that this movie is 2 hours long. It is an incredibly long, like, a children's movie. I had to do this in multiple sittings just to, like, carve out time for this film. And HBO doesn't even allow you, like Netflix, to speed up the film, if that makes sense. And there's so many, like, random council scenes in the film that I could have easily been, like, cut. And there's one where they start threatening one another with, like, guns, and I'm like, what is happening? Like, and that scene also goes nowhere. Like, some of the decisions they come to in these council scenes, nothing is ever done with them. Like, it's just, there's so much good stuff in this film. I just don't know why it needed to be 2 hours long. Yeah. But I will also say that on top of the raccoon testicles, like, all the female raccoons also have, like, breasts, like, all of them, which is just, again, a strange choice to make.
You're right. The length of the film is really strange, right? And, like, also just because of the structure of it. It's not a clear build upwards into, like, some larger action, you know.
That's
like
true.
it gets more dramatic as it goes on or whatever, but it's more just like, it's just a story, and, like, you feel like you just kind of live in it and then it's over, basically, as opposed to being on a ride, which is what it kind of feels like a lot of other films. That comes with good and bad. There are plenty of things where you're just like, what happened to the guns, you know, in that one scene? They're never brought out again. And also that scene ends with them kind of just talking him down from it. I thought that was like, holy shit, like, there's a military coup going on here in Raccoon World. And then, you know, like, an elder just kind of admonishes them, and they're like, all right, yeah, I mean, that was a bad idea. You're right. I didn't think this through very well. No question about, you know, like, you pointed a gun at the elders and all of everyone else.
Oh my God.
And, like, that seems a little extreme. They're just like, yeah, who knows? In Raccoon World, maybe that's not such a big deal because, you know, they're precocious little creatures. No, it's wild.
Yeah, in the Raccoon Council meetings, there's, like, these two factions. One is, like, more aggressive. One is trying, like, other tactics. They're all trying to get the humans to go back to living in the farmsteads so that it can support, like, the local wildlife, but construction is kind of wiping everything out. And the raccoons that are more aggressive, they want to slaughter and kill, like, all the humans. And they do manage over the course of these years to kill quite a few humans. Yeah. But which is also strange for a children's movie. But I find it really funny that they decide not to kill humans because humans make popcorn, and the raccoons like eating popcorn, and there'll be no more popcorn if all the humans die. I'm like,
There's a long scene about how much they would miss tempura, particularly mouse tempura, which is funny because it's like humans don't make mouse tempura. Like if you miss, it sounds like you're making your own. Yeah, there's so many things where it's just like, this is a movie for children, so maybe I should not be applying this.
Yeah, it was just really cute. Like, oh well, we really like eating, so we can't kill all the humans.
Yeah, it is really funny though that they actually kill quite a few. And you see a lot of the raccoons get killed too, hit by cars, trapped, shot, whatever. I don't know that I've ever seen a children's film where they have actively executed a plot to kill people, particularly in the name of environmentalism as well. You know,
true, like
we're watching a bunch of what would be referred to in the U.S. press as eco-terrorist raccoons murdering people, and that just happens.
Yeah, the movie, it does talk a lot about environmentalism. I love that it acknowledges that in the before time, humans and animals lived better together, and also acknowledges the good that humans can do for the earth, I think, because things are so dire right now with the environment. We don't always talk about how humans are really helpful for their environments and for ecology and all the ways that we can live with other creatures that can make their lives better. And one of the things I thought about as an example was something, I think it was in a science class in college, how the teacher talked about like mangrove forests, which is mangroves. I know you know this, but like they're the trees that live in like water. I don't know how to explain it any better, but they're like great breeding grounds for fish. They help with carbon storage. They protect environments from waste. They can prevent flooding. And once they cut them all down to make room for these like farms, like farming shrimp, they actually made less profit than if they had just used the environment and like lived in the way that was in accordance with the environment. I think another thing that's big right now, or that I see sometimes on social media, is people talking about single crop farming too, and how that culture is really not benefiting us in a big way anymore. And yeah, I just thought it was nice of this movie to acknowledge like humans can really do amazing things.
Yeah, it's not a purely like get all the humans out sort of situation. It's like both the raccoons and the people are facing population pressures. It's like, yeah, that's what's happening on both sides here. And not that both sides is like always a good thing to go to for the environment, but it's like, this is a very understandable problem. You have these raccoons, they have a population they're trying to support, they can no longer support it when you destroy their habitat. But the humans are also growing beyond like their own habitat constraints. They are also animals. You can have a more balanced relationship, and in some ways, humans have certainly managed the planet historically in order to promote the abundance of certain other like species, plants, animals, whatever. Yeah, I thought it was a relatively nuanced sort of take where it's just like, look, humans aren't inherently evil. We make a lot of very selfish decisions because we can, basically. It's, we can trap, we can shoot, we can do whatever to the animal population, but does that mean it's right? No. It doesn't have to be this way. Like, we are making active decisions about the ways that we're managing the planet that's causing the extinction, the decrease in these other animals. And why are we doing that?
Yeah,
we would all be happier if we weren't, in fact.
Exactly. Yeah, I want to dive into the ending already. Because I thought it was so depressing. The ending is basically there's no solution. The farmsteads are not coming back. We have habitat fragmentations, and some of the raccoons are now living as humans because they have the power to transform into humans. And some of them are selling even more land to developers and like hurting their own population even more. I'm like,
class traders.
Why? Why is it so sad?
I think this film has a lot of the like ambivalence, or allows for a lot of ambivalence is maybe the wrong term for it. I mean, it's just like, it's not really there. It does some preaching, but it's not just about preaching. Movements are complicated. Solutions are rarely complete, like on either side. These are very realistic depictions of how this sort of movement would actually go, and all of the depressing ways that it would go. Like, yeah, the raccoons posing as humans and selling their own real estate out from under, their raccoon brethren is very depressing, but absolutely happens. It's a depressing ending because it's not like it comes to a sort of solution. It's just like, what are you going to do? Like, there are better ways to go about it, but like, hey, even this movement had its own factionalism and its elements that worked against itself, like even from within.
Right.
There's so many ideologies on display here that are like jockeying for dominance, and like ultimately it just kind of becomes a sigh.
Makes me sad. There is a scene in the film where these litterers like just throw their trash on the floor, and I think the raccoons like pick it up and throw it back at them. For some reason that was very satisfying. Littering is just so annoying. Like, even a murder, you could sometimes maybe argue you were doing it out of, like, defense, but, like, littering is just like, why? You have no reason to do this. So pointless.
I have this weird idea about littering, and I try to, like, explain this to, like, fellow environmental people, and, like, I don't necessarily think it gets much traction with them, but I'm always like, I'm so depressed that I'm not finding, like, litter is never like bottles of champagne, like nice champagne or something like that. It's always just everyday shit, like no one's balling out of control and like, really just living it up for a day. It's just like, a bag of Fritos, like Coke cans or whatever, where it's like, this is just an everyday thing for you. Like if this was like, oh, it's a bottle of champagne, clearly this person is celebrating, was maybe not, like as focused on stewardship or whatever, because they're like elated, they're having like the time of their life or something like that. Like that is maybe, it's not forgivable, but it's more understandable about like why you might be neglecting where you're putting your trash or something like that. It's just like, you threw this out of your car window because you just didn't want to like take it with you to throw it away later, like that drives me crazy. Littering is just one of the most depressing things for me because it's just so casual. And it's just so casually destructive. It's so easy to throw things away in most places. But you just like, nah.
Makes me mad. It makes me mad. The other thing the movie talks about is the housing crisis. And we are still dealing with it today. I think especially during COVID, it got a lot of attention. Like the coffin homes in Hong Kong, where people were just now trapped in these like tiny little spaces, or the student living rooms. Like it was like study rooms in Korea that have now been converted into like people living there. And the thing that we're dealing with here in LA, where I'm living, is a lot of the zoning is for single family homes. So you can't build apartments or duplexes, and people like bitch about the homelessness, but nobody wants to make like the sacrifice in their own neighborhoods or do their own part. And we just recently had like a bill that was going to make zoning easier. And of course, it didn't pass. There's all these liberals living out here. Billions of dollars are getting thrown at this because we're having such huge issues with homelessness, what then also means we have issues with rodents and trash. But then people kind of like are like, not in my neighborhood, they don't want to actually do anything about it. So that's what that was going through my mind as I was watching this film.
I'm working on research right now looking at flood risk for multifamily and single family residential homes in like 4 cities in the US. And there's just so much land devoted to single family homes, like particularly here in Phoenix. And there's like some densification that's happening, but of course it's getting resisted by various groups for, various reasons, mostly bad, and cynical, and being like, well, we just can't trust these particular companies or whatever. And it's like, well, okay, but that's a convenient way to not cede any sort of resources. And people got to live somewhere, And also it's so bad for a place like Phoenix, which is already dealing with like this huge heat issue. And we have these like single family homes everywhere, and you have to like pave everything in order to provide transportation to all these homes. So you just end up like, you have this really spread out place that's just baking constantly because it's just tons and tons of black pavement that's absorbing all of this and then emanating it overnight. So the nights are hotter than they used to be too, as opposed to if we had like a denser structure. And it's very frustrating. It's just like there's so many problems. There's so much parking, which is not something I really thought about much until I lived abroad. Like even going down to like Hermosillo, Mexico, which is like 5 hours away, it's a much smaller place, and it can be smaller because there's not space for everyone's individual vehicles everywhere too, which of course is part of that's just comes naturally with single family homes in the spread out sort of place where you don't, public transportation is expensive and there's not a whole lot of will to do it either, but everyone's just like, I've got my own house and a garage or whatever, who cares, like, all the car.
So do you think that, I mean, I don't know how the science works, but do you think if there was more of like one big apartment complex that a lot of people were living in, and then the space that would free up then from the single family homes, and you could then, I don't know, plant something that would help cool down the city or do some kind of like natural feature that...
Yeah, I mean, even just the... Phoenix is complicated. Even just like the dirt, is cooler than a lot of than the pavement around here. But I mean, like I suffer where I'm at because there's so much pavement around me. That's not even necessarily locally within my apartment complex. The heat island effect is what they refer to as this, like, cities end up being several degrees hotter than the surrounding areas. Because there's so much pavement, and any amount of like keeping that down is desirable. It's complicated in a place like Phoenix because we have a lot of scorpions. Like scorpions just are a natural part of the landscape, and they're everywhere. So part of the reason that a lot of stuff gets paved here is because then they're taking it away from like scorpion habitat and like rattlesnake habitat and stuff like that too. So you have to worry about these other sort of considerations, but like, they spray so much like poison and pest control stuff here around where like we're pretty buffered in this part of the city, but you get out to the outskirts and where it's like single family housing or multifamily housing and then desert, and then they have a lot of problems with like scorpions coming in, which is another interesting aspect of there's nature is good, undesirable nature that people don't want to deal with in a place like Phoenix.
That makes sense.
Like when people kind of realize when the raccoons figure out that the movement's kind of a failure and they're kind of splitting into these like different factions, they bring in these like 3 shape-shifting masters from other like raccoon villages. It's a major plot point when they finally show up. They go through this like huge effort to try to like spook the humans and like make them, I don't know, think more about their actions and be more spiritual, and which had more ties to the land, and there's kind of a logic through there. That's a failure. One of them dies in the effort, one of the like shape-shifting elders. And then the 2 remaining ones are kind of split on what to do. One of them seems to kind of go senile and starts a dancing cult, I think is how it gets described. His name is Hage. He's 999 years old, so he's almost 1,000. And he just kind of decides that it's his time. And so there's this incredible scene where him and his dancing cult that he started like after the failure decide to just kind of depart like the elves did in the Lord of the Rings film to Valinor and boards a golden vessel, and they just kind of like him and a bunch of other raccoons presumably just sail to their death, in spite of the fact that these other raccoons are like perfectly healthy. But it was just this funny like Lord of the Rings scene in the middle of this film, which I thought was hilarious.
Again, like so random. There's so many of these little scenes that, like you said, it's just like, well, you're just living in this world. Like it doesn't have to lead anywhere. Like we're just here.
Yeah, no, it's like almost too much immersion. There's like not enough happening sometimes. You're just like, all right, so it's like this weird little petty factionalism or whatever. And, the big thing has already happened, and they're still just kind of like scrambling to figure out, well, what the fuck do we do now? And, one of them's like, I'll go senile and sail off into spiritual death, basically. it's a really good film in that there's just a lot of like spectacle, and you're just like, what is happening?
Yeah.
In a lot of it, but it doesn't work as a film in a lot of the traditional, ways that we would judge them, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't really have like the 3-act structure or, normal storytelling. It doesn't really
No,
follow that at all.
it really defies the 3-act structure. Did you watch this with subs or dubs?
The HBO one, it only allowed me to watch it in English. I didn't
So
have an... Oh, sorry.
you actually can change that in HBO Max. I was able to watch the Japanese version.
Okay, maybe I just didn't figure it out. I was messing around with it, and I was like, I couldn't find it. I just watched it in English.
No, it's fine. But I mean, this works out well. So I didn't realize this until I finally went and looked up who did the voice acting for the English version. But Jonathan Taylor Thomas is Shokichi, who's like one of the main raccoons, and I thought that was really funny. I was like, JTT, I haven't thought about him in forever.
Jonathan Taylor. Wait, I have to Google him.
He was the teen heartthrob from Home Improvement.
Okay.
There's a lot of outraged people from our generation who are like, you don't know JTT? What the hell? Yeah, no, he was a phenomenon. Another character is voiced by J.K. Simmons, who is great always and everything. But then Ryutaro, which is another one of the raccoons, is actually voiced by John DiMaggio, who is the voice actor who later voiced Bender. Stand-up comedian fans, Brian Posehn, who's a weird alt comic from like the 90s and early 2000s, actually voiced a character in this. It was a weird like convergence of extremely 90s people who came together and voiced it, which I thought was, I mean, like getting JTT was clearly a reach for like, who's the most famous person we can pay to like try to get an audience into this. And I don't know anyone who has seen this film in my friend group, so I don't think it succeeded at all.
Never ever heard of this film. Also, another thing I really loved about this film was the background, just the watercolor spreads that they used just for the background. I thought were so gorgeous. Like, really, really nice. The artwork. I mean, it's a Ghibli film, so of course it's gonna be nice.
Yeah, no, the backgrounds are really good. There's a lot of really good, like, metaphorical imagery. Like, early on, there's like they're trying to show the progress of construction over these environmental areas. And there's this one scene where there's like narration over it, kind of talking about development in the region. And it's like a leaf in the foreground and like a city in the background. And you have these like, I don't know, like backhoes basically. That are kind of driving around this leaf and like taking chunks out of it. Like how bugs eat through a leaf, and then like as they're eating the green parts of the leaf away, you get to see more of the city in the background. There's a lot of like really beautiful like metaphorical imagery in this as well, which is, I don't necessarily know that it would have been that impactful for me as the dumb kid I was, but it's really beautiful, and both in terms of the animation is really good, but I think they also really went out of their way to try to think of other ways to describe like environmental impacts. Was there any point in this film where you were like really touched or like moved? I doubt you cried during it or anything like that.
No, I don't think so. Are you talking about the scene where they have like, they give everyone the vision of like what life could have been like? Is that the scene that you're thinking of, or?
That's not the one that kind of got me on that one. There's one scene where a couple of the raccoons decide that they need to make contact with the humans and get in touch with like a news crew, because there's been rumors that raccoons are the source of delays in construction because the raccoons are doing all sort of mischievous sort of efforts. So it's kind of like being floated around, like there's witnesses who are like, it was the raccoons. And of course society is like, it's not the raccoons. That's crazy. But it's happened enough times. Enough people have said something about it where, in the back of society's mind, they're like, well, maybe there's something to that. But anyway, so the raccoons finally get in contact with a news crew and call them out to the woods basically. And the news crew shows up, and the raccoons are like, too shy to be like filmed on camera, so they're like talking to him through the bushes, and the news crew is like, you got to come out and like show your faces, otherwise no one's going to believe that you're raccoons or whatever. And so they finally step out and they talk about their plight, but then they I forget like what exactly is said, but then they all turn into a bunch of like forest creatures like deer, squirrel, whatever, and start like capering around and like really shock like the news crew. I think they end up like bowling them over at some point. But for whatever reason, I thought that was like really touching because they're kind of getting into just like, this is everything that's being lost, you know, just in terms of like the fauna of this region. And it's really heartbreaking. Living in a place that is like totally devoid of like environmental interaction, like interaction with wildlife it sucks. I mean, like if you're stuck in the middle of a city, you know, what do you got? Like squirrels and pigeons? Like that's pretty much it. But you're living in an area that is normally the home to beaver, to muskrat, to deer, to moose, whatever, you know, and you'll never encounter that in your daily life. You have, if you're lucky enough to have enough money to like escape the city, maybe you'll get lucky and see something, but kids just grow up in these situations and never have these sort of encounters. And everyone's life is poorer for it, honestly. I don't know. I thought it was really touching, you know, sort of the plight of the animals and just being like, how do we communicate how bad this is, you know, like for all of us?
But then in the movie, like nothing happens with that. Like nobody learns from that, which is again like, oh, real life. All the environmental havoc we're wreaking.
I think it kind of ends with them saying like, yeah, they tried to like put more parks in and so forth. And, you know, some of the raccoons were able to kind of live in those areas. But like the end scene is them dancing on a golf course, and golf course is not an appropriate natural landscape for wildlife. And explicitly they're like driven out of those areas. There's so many things where it's just like, this sucks. Like I wanted there to be like a solution or something like that to come out of this, but they just kind of hit you with the reality of it and like, yeah, this is what you're dealing with. Like, I don't know. It's a good film. It made me feel really deeply for a lot of this stuff, but not in a way that was uplifting. It's just like, damn, like this does suck. Like we got to do something about this.
But I mean, that's part of what you're studying, what your job is too, right? Just being depressed all the time about the environment.
I mean, I wish I'm like trying to segue into more work that's looking at biodiversity. And so I work on like wetlands in cities, basically. That's my main concern, but I do it for like flooding and hydrological reasons. But I worked in these urban wetlands in a city in southern Chile and was doing informal work that's not part of my research on like wildlife surveys in them. And yeah, like I'm all about like, yeah, there's no beaver here. There's no otters, which would normally be here. There's this particular species of wetland bird called the siete colorace that's like beautiful. And everyone associates it with the wetlands, but it's gone from the urban wetlands. It's not there at all. You have to like go out of the city in order to do it, or in order to like actually have a chance at seeing one. So, you know, the good news is that there are things we can do to actively, you know, keep wildlife and keep the environments healthy in cities. We just don't. So it's nice in that some of my work is like aimed toward actually treating the environment in a way that's beneficial for all parties, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And we have a long legacy of not doing that we're fighting against.
Yeah, that's just like what I want to like tell people is like doing this stuff helps you too. Like it's not like, oh, if we have to save the environment, humans will suffer, not make enough money, or you know, it's like
it's really confused in the environmental movement too. There's like a whole field of environmental economics that's like, okay, so you people only think about the monetary value of things. Well, here's our best effort at putting a monetary value on all these different aspects of these like landscape features. Everything from like being able to cut down trees in this area sustainably in order to produce like wood yields, to the psychological benefits, to water purification, to whatever. So like, okay, if we're gonna make this compete against like a new shopping center, here's the environmental value of what this is providing you currently in US dollars or whatever. Like, so this is the number to beat in a lot of cases. And number one, you don't get in the door in a lot of places with that sort of argument. So it's already kind of like a flawed way of going. But then also there's always the chance that the dollar value that you come up with, which is always kind of ridiculous anyway, because it's like, how much, you know, what's the dollar value of having a family of beaver like in this area. You know, like it's just it's intangible in a lot of important ways. But you produce this dollar value, which is kind of bullshit in the first place, but whatever. And then they're like, yeah, well, the shopping center produces this much amount of money, so we're gonna do that. You know. But yeah, I mean, talk to anyone who's spent time around nature, like. And it's invaluable, like inherently. And cities care about money, they care about tax revenue, etc. There's a movement. We're figuring out ways to weasel in environmental protections into discussions with like city officials and so forth. So.
But it's so interesting also how the last presidency has changed that. I was just recently reading an article how there's this. What is the term? I think it's called a brain drain because the current American President Biden, he was looking for these people to finally go back and fill these spots of like studying the environment and all that. And those people were like, no, if you don't get reelected, I'm just going to lose my job again in 4 years. And like, there's no stability here. And that's also why we don't have many of the contracts with not just with environmental stuff, but with any kind of commercial venture with other countries, because their governments may have somebody in charge for a much longer time and they don't have executive orders and they don't, you know, it's like I'm this auto company and I might sign a deal with, you know, the United States for something, but I know that might fall through like 4 years from now. And it's just the instability that the structure of this government has is also not conducive to like solving a lot of things.
Yeah, it's the instability, and then I think also just like the stark contrast that the parties are trying to create between each other.
Right.
Like there's a lot that's like done by one administration, and like the conservatives are like, well, that's bad because they're doing it, so you know, you have to be opposed to it. But there's this sort of weird politicization of this issue that doesn't exist in a lot of other countries. It doesn't some certainly, but like, yeah, you're right. Like. If I take this position under you, I'm out in the next administration. Like that's it for me. And this work which, you know, environmental work takes a long time. Yeah. And so it has to be something with a vision and a budget for longer than the current administration before the political tide changes. Yeah. And someone comes in and was like, well, that was the last administration's priority. And by virtue of it being their priority, it is now a priority to stop it, like under this administration. My advisor from Chile, who's like, you know, very liberal, probably more on the leftist side, took a job under the conservative administration working in the environment because it's just like these are projects that both parties can agree on are important regardless of the other political ideologies like at play here. I just feel like it's really tough to find that in the United States.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anything else about?
No. I did watch other Miyazaki films that are also very good. Spirited Away rocks. That is an incredible film. Princess Mononoke finally watched, also rocks.
Also about the environment.
Yeah. Also an environmental parable. Really cool. It also kind of has an ambiguous resolution to it as well.
That's true.
You know, it's kind of like, what are you gonna do? We already chopped the head off of the deer god, and there's no going back from that. You know, but can we forge some, you know, a better way forward that's more in balance with it? Well, we got to try something. You know.
Have you seen Howl's Moving Castle at all?
Yes.
So that's my favorite Miyazaki film, and the book is kind of like this beautiful magical story. And then he takes that and makes it about like war and what are the effects of war on a population. And it's just one of those classic, like, you know, Miyazaki moves of like, let's talk about something bigger here. It's one of those instances where the movie and the book they're very different, but each do their own thing in the best way that they can, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I need to go back and rewatch that. I saw it years ago and was not giving it my full attention, but I remember the animation in that being just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, Miyazaki has that, or Studio Ghibli in general has that finesse that I'm sometimes lacking from Frank Herbert talking about some of these like big issues.
Yeah, there's more ambiguity allowed in Miyazaki films, which I think is his explicit intent. I think I've like seen in interviews where he's just like, I'm not interested in the sort of linear storytelling or these concrete pat resolutions to things. That's just not how the real world is. I think it ends up like not being as preachy, I think, in ways that a lot of...
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's just like, it's complicated, man. Like here's kind of the smorgasbord. It's obvious that some of these are better than others, but it's tough to know in the moment. Relationships are complicated. Sometimes one of your strongest allies and your biggest hopes goes senile and creates a dancing cult and sails off with part of your tribe, you know, like
that's life.
You know, that's how it goes to Valinor. Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. That is the end of our episode. Jason, thank you so much again for coming on to talk to us about this. And where can people find you online?
I'm at Jason R. Sauer, Sauer on Twitter. And that's pretty much it. I'm off other social media. I'm thinking about restarting my Instagram, which is the same name, because I do like photography, but I hate Zuckerberg. So I'm trying to figure out what to do about that. But anyway.
Aren't we all? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jason.